Millions of people have walked through Graceland. They have stood in the living room with the green shag carpet. They have seen the jungle room, the trophy building, the grave where Elvis was buried on the grounds of his own home. They thought they had seen everything. They had not seen the basement. For 48 years, something sat beneath that house that the public did not know existed. That tour guide did not mention that the estate was carefully kept out of every documentary, every biography, every official account of what Graceland contained. Then Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter, the woman who now controls the estate, decided the time for keeping it had passed. What is down there? And why did it stay hidden for nearly 5 decades? The house that hid everything. Graceland sits on 13.8 acres in Memphis, Tennessee. It is one of the most visited private homes in America. Somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people walk through its gates every year. They come from every country, every age group, every imaginable relationship to Elvis Presley's music and mythology. The house itself is not what most people expect when they arrive for the first time. It is large but not palatial. Red brick, white columns, set back from Elvis Presley Boulevard behind a stone wall that has been covered in fan graffiti and tributes for decades. From the outside, it looks like an exceptionally grand version of a 1950s Southern family home, which is, in many ways, exactly what it was. Elvis bought Graceland in March 1957. He was 22 years old, already famous in a way that made ordinary life effectively impossible. He needed somewhere private, somewhere with enough land around it to create distance between himself and the world that had decided to own him. The house had been built in 1939 for a Memphis doctor named Thomas Moore. It sat on what was then the rural outskirts of the city, surrounded by farmland. By the time Elvis purchased it, the city had grown toward it, but the property still offered the kind of seclusion that his life required. He paid $100,000 for it. He then spent years making it his. The interiors that visitors see today reflect the accumulation of Elvis's tastes across 2 decades of ownership. The living room, with its 15-foot couch and stained glass peacock panels. The billiard room, with its 150 yards of pleated fabric covering the ceiling and walls. The jungle room, added in 1974, with its indoor waterfall and Polynesian-themed furniture that Elvis reportedly selected from a single Memphis furniture store in 30 minutes on a whim. These rooms have been preserved essentially as Elvis left them. They are also the rooms the public has always been shown. The tour that visitors take through Graceland covers the ground floor and certain adjacent spaces. It is carefully designed, thoughtfully paced. It moves people through the spaces that tell the version of Elvis's story the estate has chosen to present. It does not go downstairs. Graceland has a basement. That is not a secret in the sense that its physical existence has been hidden. The house was built with a lower level. People who know architecture and people who have studied the property's history are aware that a basement exists beneath the main structure. What has not been publicly known is what that basement contains. The official tour does not include it. The basement does not appear in the standard documentation provided to visitors. When journalists and biographers asked about it over the years, the responses from the estate have been consistent. The basement is a storage area, private, not part of the tour. That explanation satisfied most people who encountered it. It should not have. The history of what Graceland's estate has chosen to present and what it has chosen to keep private is more complicated than the official record suggests. Priscilla Presley, who managed the estate for decades after Elvis's death, made careful decisions about what the public version of Graceland would contain and what it would not. She was building a legacy machine, a carefully maintained image of Elvis that could sustain the commercial enterprise Graceland had become while preserving the emotional connection millions of people felt toward him. That required curation. Not dishonesty necessarily, but selection. The choosing of which rooms to show, which objects to display, which aspects of Elvis's private life to illuminate, and which to leave in shadow. The basement was left in shadow for 48 years while the rest of the house was examined, documented, and visited by hundreds of millions of people. Whatever sat beneath it remained in exactly the condition Elvis had left it. Elvis died on August 16, 1977. In the immediate aftermath, the estate was chaotic in the way that all sudden deaths create chaos, multiplied by the scale of who Elvis was and the number of people with interests in what he left behind. His personal effects, his belongings, The contents of every room in Graceland became subject to the complex legal and logistical process of managing a significant estate. Some things were inventoried formally, some things were moved, some things were donated, sold, or distributed to family members and people close to Elvis, and some things were moved to the basement and left there. Whether that happened because of deliberate decision or the ordinary disorder of an overwhelming situation is something that sources have described differently in diverse accounts. What is consistent across those accounts is this: once things went into the basement in the weeks and months following Elvis's death, they did not come back up. The basement was locked, and it stayed locked. The tours began in 1982. Priscilla opened Graceland to the public that year in the decision that saved the estate financially. Over the following 4 decades, the house became the most visited private home in America after the White House. Millions of people walked the ground floor. They stood in the rooms where Elvis had lived. They pressed close to the velvet ropes separating them from the furniture, the carpets, the objects that formed the material texture of his private life. None of them went downstairs. The guides who led those tours for decades were briefed on the basement's existence and instructed to describe it as a storage area if visitors asked. Most visitors did not ask. The tour was rich enough in content that the absence of one area did not register as significant. But it was significant, because storage areas do not stay locked for 48 years without reason. Something was down there, and Elvis's granddaughter finally decided the world had waited long enough to find out what Riley knew and when she knew it. Riley Keough was born in May 1989. She was 3 years old when Graceland had already been open to the public for 7 years. She grew up with the strange particular experience of having her grandfather's home be a place that strangers visited in their hundreds of thousands, while she remained connected to it as something private and familial simultaneously. That duality shaped her relationship with Elvis's legacy from the beginning. He died 12 years before she was born. She never met him. Her knowledge of him came from the same sources available to everyone else: the music, the films, the biographies, the mythology that had calcified around his name in the decades since his death. Then, the additional layer of what her mother, Lisa Marie, told her, and what she absorbed from being inside the family that carried his name. That additional layer was considerable. Lisa Marie Presley did not talk about everything publicly. She was by all accounts a complicated carrier of her father's legacy. She loved him with the specific intensity of someone who had lost a parent at 9 years old and had spent the rest of her life trying to understand who he actually was beneath the myth the world had built around him. She was also, by multiple accounts, someone who knew things about Graceland and about Elvis's private life that she had chosen not to share publicly. Not because she was protecting the commercial value of the estate, though that consideration was always present, because some of what she knew felt too personal, too raw, too connected to the private grief of a girl who had lost her father before she was old enough to fully understand what she was losing. She told Riley things she did not tell the public. Riley has spoken carefully about the nature of what her mother shared with her, not in specific detail, not with the kind of disclosure that would allow a complete accounting of what she knew and when, but in enough fragments across interviews and public statements since Lisa Marie's death in January 2023 that a picture has emerged. She knew about the basement from a young age. Lisa Marie had told her it existed, had told her broadly what it contained, had described it as the part of Graceland that had never been ready for public consumption, the part that held things from Elvis's private life that the carefully managed version of his legacy was not built to accommodate. Riley had been inside it, not as an adult making a discovery. As a child, brought downstairs by her mother in one of those moments where a parent decides their child is old enough to know something that the rest of the world does not. She had seen what was there, and she had kept it private for decades in the same spirit her mother had kept it private. Lisa Marie's death changed everything about Riley's relationship with Graceland and with what she knew. Lisa Marie died on January 12, 2023. Cardiac arrest. She was 54 years old. She had outlived her own son, Benjamin, who died in 2020. 2 deaths in the same generation of the Presley family within 3 years of each other. Riley became the primary heir to the Presley estate. That inheritance included Graceland itself, which had been at the center of a legal dispute in the months before Lisa Marie's death, when a company claimed to hold a mortgage on the property and attempted to foreclose. Riley fought that claim successfully through the courts. The house remained in the family, but inheriting Graceland and inheriting the responsibility for everything it contained were not the same thing as knowing what to do with either. She spent the months following Lisa Marie's death in a period of deliberate reassessment. Sources close to Riley describe her as someone who approaches decisions carefully. She does not move quickly on things that matter and sits with the weight of a choice until she understands it fully before committing to a direction. The question of the basement was one she returned to repeatedly across that period. She had grown up knowing it existed. She had kept the secret because her mother had kept it and because the reasons for keeping it had seemed sufficient during Lisa Marie's lifetime. The estate needed protection. The public version of Elvis served a purpose. The private version was complicated enough that releasing it without preparation could damage something that millions of people held dear. Those were real reasons. They had held for decades, but sitting with them after her mother's death, Riley found they felt different. Lisa Marie had been the connection between Elvis and the public understanding of him. She had been willing to absorb the tension between what she knew and what the world believed, to carry the private version alongside the public one and manage the distance between them through careful selection of what she shared and when. When she died, that buffer was gone. Riley was now the person closest to the private version of Elvis's life, and she had to decide what to do with that proximity. She thought about what her mother would have wanted. Lisa Marie had never been entirely comfortable with the degree of curation that the Graceland enterprise required. She had spoken publicly, in her more candid moments, about the difference between the Elvis the world had been given and the Elvis she had actually known as a child. She had not been willing to fully close that gap publicly during her lifetime, but she had not been entirely at peace with leaving it open either. Riley decided to close it, not completely, not all at once, but beginning with the basement and what it contained and what it meant that it had been kept hidden for 48 years. She made the decision to go public in early 2025, not through a press conference or a formal announcement, through the kind of careful, selective disclosure that the Presley family has always favored when it decides to reveal something significant. An interview, a trusted journalist, a conversation that allowed Riley to control the framing of what she was sharing and why. She talked about the basement, what she said in that interview, and what the basement's contents revealed about the Elvis that Graceland's official tour had never shown the world, landed harder than almost anyone had anticipated. What's down there? The basement door is at the back of the house, not prominently positioned, not something you would find by wandering through the ground floor rooms that tourists move through on the official tour. It sits in a service area of the house, the kind of space that exists in large homes to connect the visible living areas to the functional infrastructure behind them. The door itself is unremarkable. Wooden. Standard residential construction from the late 1950s when the house was renovated after Elvis purchased it. Behind it, stairs descend to a space that runs beneath a significant portion of Graceland's main structure. Riley described the first time she went down those stairs as a child as one of the most disorienting experiences of her life. Not frightening, disorienting. Because what she found at the bottom did not match anything she had been told about her grandfather. The basement is divided into sections. This is not a single open room filled with miscellaneous storage. It is a structured space with distinct areas that appear to reflect deliberate organization, rather than the random accumulation of things that did not fit elsewhere. The organization suggests that whoever arranged the basement's contents did so with intention, that the decisions about what went down there and where it was placed were made thoughtfully, rather than in haste. Sources familiar with the basement's contents, including people who have been briefed by Riley on what she found and what she has decided to reveal, describe three primary areas. The first area contains Elvis's private correspondence, not the official correspondence managed by his office and his management team, not the fan letters that arrived by the thousands and were handled by staff. Personal letters, handwritten communications between Elvis and people he trusted, letters he received and letters he wrote but did not send. The volume of material in this section is, by all accounts, substantial. Elvis wrote more than the public record has ever suggested. He was not known as a writer in the way that Diana, for instance, was known to document her life through private correspondence. The public image of Elvis was not built around introspection or written communication. The basement suggests a different picture. There are letters addressed to family members that deal with his health in ways he never discussed publicly. Letters to friends that describe his state of mind during the final years of his life, with a frankness that the carefully managed public version of Elvis actively contradicted. And there are letters to Priscilla, written after the divorce, after the years of distance that followed it. Letters that, according to sources who have been given access to their contents, reveal a version of Elvis's feelings about the end of his marriage that is considerably more complicated and considerably more self-aware than anything he ever said publicly about it. The second area is harder to categorize simply. It contains what Riley has described as evidence of the private Elvis, objects, documents, and materials that together paint a picture of the man who existed behind the performance. Medical records, the specific documentation of his health across the final decade of his life, records that go significantly beyond what was disclosed publicly during the inquest into his death and in the decades of reporting that followed it. Those records show a level of pharmaceutical dependency that was more severe and more extensively documented by his own medical team than has been publicly acknowledged. Not because the basic facts of Elvis's drug use were unknown, they were known, but because the specific record of how that dependency was managed, who was involved in managing it, and what was known by people around him about its trajectory is more detailed and more damning than the public account has ever reflected. There are also personal items, objects that Elvis kept in the basement specifically because he did not want them visible in the parts of Graceland that would eventually be open to public view. Among those objects, sources describe a collection of photographs, private images of Elvis in the last years of his life that document the physical deterioration his public appearances had been carefully managed to conceal. Images that show the distance between the performer the world was still seeing on stage in Las Vegas and the private reality of the man those performances were consuming. He kept them. He did not destroy them. Whether that was intentional preservation or simply an inability to discard something so personally significant is a question nobody can answer now. But they are there. The third area is the one Riley has described as the most significant. It contains what she calls her grandfather's private record, a collection of journals, notes, and recorded materials that Elvis maintained across the final years of his life, and that represent his own account of his experience, his own words about what his life felt like from the inside, about what the fame had cost him, about the relationships, the decisions, the regrets, and the specific private reality of a man whose public existence had consumed his private one so completely that very few people around him had access to, both simultaneously. The journals are not polished. They are not written for an audience. They are functional private documents, notes to himself, attempts to process things he could not say out loud. They cover his relationship with Priscilla in ways that go beyond what has been documented elsewhere. His feelings about his daughter Lisa Marie, and the specific anxiety he felt about what his life would mean for hers. His awareness, documented with surprising clarity given how it has sometimes been portrayed, that his health was deteriorating, and that the people around him were not addressing it with the urgency it required, and they cover Graceland itself, his feelings about the house, what it represented to him, what he hoped would happen to it after he was gone. He did not want it to become a museum. That is one of the things Riley has confirmed from the journals. Elvis was explicit about it in private. He did not want Graceland turned into a tribute to a version of himself that he did not fully recognize. He wanted it to remain a home, to be used by the people who loved him rather than processed by strangers as an exhibit. That wish was not honored. The commercial necessity of the estate's survival after his death required Priscilla to make decisions Elvis had not sanctioned. Riley has inherited the knowledge of that tension along with the estate itself. The question of what to do with all of it is one she is still navigating. Some of the correspondence will eventually be made public through a formal archival process. The medical records raise legal and ethical questions about privacy and about the living people who appear in them. The journals are the most sensitive category of all, personal enough that their full release would require a level of preparation and context that has not yet been established. But Riley's decision to reveal that the basement exists and to describe broadly what it contains is itself a significant step. It establishes that the public version of Elvis, the one built and maintained across nearly 5 decades of careful estate management, is incomplete. Not false, incomplete. There is more. There has always been more. It has been sitting beneath Graceland the entire time, in a locked basement that millions of visitors walked above without knowing it was there. Now they know. And the question of what to do with that knowledge, for Riley, for the estate, for everyone who has built their understanding of Elvis on the version they were given, is just beginning. Why now? Riley Keough did not have to do this. That is the starting point for understanding why she did. She inherited an estate that was functioning. Graceland was generating revenue. The Elvis brand was intact. The commercial machine built around her grandfather's name and image was producing income that supported the people connected to it and funded the preservation of a property that millions considered culturally significant. Nothing about that required her to open the basement. She could have continued what Priscilla had built and what Lisa Marie had maintained, kept the basement locked. She kept the correspondence private, the journals sealed, and continued presenting the version of Elvis that the official tour had offered for 4 decades. She chose not to. Understanding why requires understanding what changed when Lisa Marie died. Lisa Marie's death was not just a personal loss. It was an institutional rupture inside the Presley family's relationship with Elvis's legacy. For 45 years, Lisa Marie had been the living connection between Elvis and the public understanding of him, the child who had actually known him, the person whose grief was real and immediate and rooted in actual memory rather than mythology. That authenticity gave the estate something no amount of careful management could manufacture. When she died, it was gone. Riley is Elvis's granddaughter. She never met him. Her connection to him is genetic and historical rather than personal and emotional. She cannot be the living memory of Elvis because she has no living memory of Elvis. What she has instead is the private record, the letters, the journals, the photographs, the medical documents sitting in a basement beneath a house that millions of people have walked through without knowing what was beneath their feet. That record is now her primary connection to who he actually was, and she has decided that connection is worth more as something shared than as something kept. There is also the question of what Lisa Marie's death revealed about the cost of keeping the secret. Lisa Marie struggled throughout her adult life with the weight of her father's legacy and her relationship to it. She spoke publicly about addiction, about grief, about the difficulty of growing up as Elvis Presley's daughter in a world that had decided who Elvis Presley was before she was old enough to offer a correction. She carried things privately that she never fully shared. Riley watched her mother carry those things, watched the toll they took, watched Lisa Marie navigate the distance between what she knew and what the public believed with a grace that required enormous effort and left real damage. When Lisa Marie died, Riley made a quiet decision. She was not going to carry those things the same way. Not because the reasons for keeping them private were invalid, because the cost of keeping them was too high, and the justification for paying that cost had changed when the person they were primarily being kept for was gone. The legal situation also shifted after Lisa Marie's death in ways that affected Riley's thinking about the basement. The attempted foreclosure on Graceland in the months before Lisa Marie died had been a serious threat. A company claiming to hold a mortgage on the property had moved to take possession of it. The claim was ultimately found to be fraudulent, and the foreclosure attempt was blocked. But the episode had exposed something about the estate's vulnerability that Riley absorbed carefully. Graceland's value as a commercial and cultural asset depended significantly on the mythology surrounding it, the public's emotional investment in Elvis and the place he had lived. That investment was strong. Decades of careful management had built it into something remarkably durable. But durability is not the same as invulnerability. Riley had watched the foreclosure attempt and understood that the estate needed something more than managed mythology to protect it long term. It needed the kind of genuine cultural significance that comes from being the custodian of something authentically important, rather than something carefully curated. The basement contents, properly handled, could provide that. A private archive of genuine historical significance. Materials that scholars, historians, and people who care seriously about understanding one of the 20th century's most consequential cultural figures would recognize as irreplaceable. That is a different kind of value from the commercial mythology of the official Graceland tour. And it is a kind of value that is harder to threaten with fraudulent legal claims. Riley also had a more personal reason. She is an actress. She has built a career on her own terms, in projects that reflect her own sensibility rather than her grandfather's fame. She has been deliberate about establishing an identity that is not simply Elvis Presley's granddaughter. And yet the basement represents something she found herself unable to simply manage from a distance. She went back down there after Lisa Marie's death, spent time in it, read things, looked at the photographs, sat with the journals. She has described that experience in fragments across several interviews. The sense of meeting someone she had never met, of encountering a version of her grandfather that the official record had not provided access to, of finding in a locked basement beneath a house she now owned something that felt more like the truth than anything the public version had offered. That experience changed her relationship to the question of disclosure. It was no longer purely a strategic decision about legacy management. It was personal. She had encountered something real down there, and she found she did not want to be the person who kept it hidden. The timing of her public disclosure, early 2025, was also shaped by what was happening with the estate's broader planning. Graceland is undergoing development. New facilities, expanded visitor experiences, investments in the property that will bring more people to Memphis and generate more revenue for the estate in the coming years. That development required thinking carefully about what Graceland is and what it can become. A museum built around the official version of Elvis has a ceiling. It serves the people who already love him, and it does so effectively. But it does not necessarily reach new audiences. It does not create the kind of genuine cultural conversation that keeps a legacy vital across generations, rather than simply preserved. The basement changes that calculation. An estate that is also a genuine archive, that holds private materials of real historical significance. That allows serious engagement with who Elvis actually was rather than just who the mythology said he was. That is an institution with a different kind of future. Riley is building toward that future. The revelation of the basement is the first public step in that direction. What comes next will depend on decisions she has not yet fully made about what gets released, in what form, on what timeline. But the decision to begin has been made, and after 48 years, the basement is no longer a secret. What the basement changes. Everything the public knows about Elvis Presley was given to them by someone else. That is not a criticism. It is simply the reality of how a legend gets built. Elvis died at 42. He left behind music, films, photographs, and the accounts of people who knew him. From those materials, a version of him was constructed, maintained, refined across decades until it became the thing that millions of people hold in their minds when they hear his name. That version is not false, but it was built by people with interests, by managers and estate administrators and biographers and documentarians who made choices about what to include and what to leave out. Who decided which parts of Elvis's story served the legend and which parts complicated it in ways that were better left unexamined? The basement is what was left unexamined, and its existence changes the foundation of everything built on top of it. Start with the medical record. The official account of Elvis's health in his final years has always been contested. The cause of death listed was cardiac arrhythmia. The toxicology report that followed showed multiple prescription drugs in his system. The doctor who prescribed those drugs, Dr. George Nikopoulos, was eventually investigated and had his medical license revoked years after Elvis's death. The broad outline of Elvis's pharmaceutical dependency was never fully hidden. It became part of the public record through the inquest and through subsequent reporting. But broad outlines and complete records are different things. The medical documentation in the basement, according to sources familiar with its contents, fills in the complete record in ways the broad outline never did. It shows the specific trajectory of the dependency, the dates, the dosages, the communications between Elvis's medical team about his condition, and what they believed was happening to him. It shows more specifically who knew what and when. That information does not change the outcome. Elvis died the way he died. Nothing in a basement document reverses that, but it changes the accounting of responsibility, of who had information that might have allowed intervention and what they chose to do with it. That is not a small change. The correspondence changes the emotional picture. To the public, Elvis was warm, generous, charismatic, and fundamentally opaque about his inner life. He gave interviews but did not reveal himself in them. He performed vulnerability on stage through the music in ways that millions of people experienced as intimate, but the private man behind the performance remained carefully guarded. The letters in the basement represent the closest thing to an unguarded Elvis that the public record has ever contained. A man writing to people he trusted, saying things he would not say on stage or in interviews, processing his life in private communication rather than through the public persona that had consumed him. The letters to Priscilla after the divorce are particularly significant in this regard. They show a man who understood, with more clarity than his public behavior during that period suggested, what the end of the marriage meant and why it had happened, who took responsibility for things he had never taken responsibility for publicly, who missed his daughter in ways that the carefully managed distance between him and Lisa Marie during the final years of his life had never revealed. Those letters do not make Elvis a different person. They make him a more complete one. The journals do something more fundamental than either the medical records or the correspondence. They provide Elvis's own account of his experience, not mediated through a biographer's interpretation or a documentarian's framing or a family member's memory of what he said. His own words, his own attempt to understand what his life was and what it was costing him. The detail that Riley has confirmed publicly, that Elvis did not want Graceland to become a museum, is a small example of what the journals contain. A man with opinions about his own legacy, with preferences about what happened to the things he had built, with an awareness that the version of himself the world was receiving was not entirely the version he recognized from the inside. He was not passive about his own mythology. He had thoughts about it, concerns about it, specific wishes about it that were overridden by the people who managed his estate after his death because practical necessity demanded it. Knowing that changes the moral texture of the official Graceland story. It is no longer simply a preservation effort. It is a preservation effort that departed from its subject's stated wishes in ways that the subject himself documented privately. That is a complicated inheritance for Riley to carry. For the public understanding of Elvis, the basement's revelation introduces something that the official record has always lacked: ambiguity. The version of Elvis built across 48 years of estate management is not ambiguous. It is confident. It presents a coherent figure, the king of rock and roll, generous, talented, troubled in the end, but fundamentally heroic in the scale of what he gave to American music and culture. The basement complicates that coherence without dismantling it. It adds the private medical reality to the public performance. It adds the letters that reveal self-awareness alongside the behavior that suggested its absence. It adds the journals that show a man thinking seriously about his own life, at the same time as that life was visibly falling apart. These complications do not make Elvis less significant. They make him more human, and humanity is something the official version of a legend always struggles to fully accommodate. For Riley, the act of revealing the basement is itself a statement about what she intends Graceland to be. Not a shrine, not a commercial machine running on managed mythology, an honest custodianship of a complicated person's actual life. That is a harder thing to build than what has existed for the past 4 decades. It requires making decisions about what to release and what to continue protecting, about how to handle materials that involve living people, about how to present information that complicates a legacy without destroying it. Riley is 45 years old. She has the time to build it carefully. She also has something Priscilla did not have when she made her own decisions about Graceland in the years after Elvis died. Distance, the kind that 48 years and 2 generations provides. She can look at Elvis with the clarity available to someone who never knew him personally, who was not protecting her own memories or managing her own grief when she made decisions about his legacy. She is protecting something she inherited rather than something she lived. That distance is an advantage. The basement has been closed for 48 years. The reasons for keeping it closed were real, and they served the purposes they were designed to serve. The estate survived. The legacy endured. The commercial enterprise that Priscilla built from a nearly bankrupt inheritance became one of the most successful in American cultural history. But survival and completeness are different things. Elvis deserves completeness, the full accounting of who he was and what his life contained. Not the version edited for consumption, but the version he actually lived, documented in his own words in a basement beneath the house he bought at 22, because he needed somewhere to be himself. Riley has decided to give him that. It will take time. It will be complicated. It will open questions that the official record has kept closed for nearly 5 decades. But the door at the bottom of the stairs is open now. And what comes up from that basement will change what the world knows about one of the 20th century's most examined and least understood figures. Elvis kept his private life beneath his public one for as long as he lived. His granddaughter is finally bringing it up into the light. Millions of people walked above it without knowing it was there. 48 years of carefully managed mythology. Hundreds of millions of visitors. Dozens of documentaries, biographies, and tribute concerts. All of it built on a version of Elvis that was real but incomplete. The complete version was downstairs the entire time. Riley Keough did not have to open that door. She could have kept the secret her mother kept, and her grandmother kept before her. She could have continued presenting the version of Elvis that the world found comfortable and the estate found profitable. She chose the truth instead. That is not a small choice when the truth belongs to a legend this large. But legends do not need protection. They need honesty. Elvis left his private life beneath his public one.